So the dub cycles are all about writing an exercycle to make some kind of music, and 3 exercycles in fact. So I thought I'd give you a little bit of a how-to or a explanation as to the anatomy of a dub cycle. So it's really simple. There's only 3 things on each one. These 2 buttons, which I wired into the ends of the handlebars. Wire goes down through the tube, and then it all meets together a little box here. Also, the other one is a sensor, which you can just see there, that magnet coming past and moving past there is a magnetic reed sensor. So each of those provide a switch, and all the wires go into this box. Here's a little box with the lid off. You can kind of see it's using a standard LAN socket, which it's quite useful because the cabling is quite simple and it locks. It's pretty durable and it's easy to get LAN cables. What's not very fun is all the wiring which has to be done to connect that LAN socket into some binding posts in order to be able to wire the thing up. Unfortunately, LAN sockets are not designed to sit onto strip board. They've got a smaller pin pitch and really only for surface mount, so I spent quite a little time wiring that all up. These LAN sockets have 2 little LEDs in them, and they would normally show activity, and I decided I'd use them to tell you whether the circuit is working. And there's another LED which I wanted to indicate activity, so when the person is pedaling or a button is pressed, then that light would flash. That doesn't work at the moment, but I will do that at some stage. So 3 of those cables come into 3 more sockets, which are soldered onto strip board in this mess here. This is the top side. The rear is set with headers, and then I just used DuPont cable to connect it all up. Got 2 microcontrollers here, and I'll explain one at a time what they do. I'm using these cheap little Arduino Nano clones, which are about $1.20 from AliExpress. They're very cheap and cheerful, and they do most of what I want most of the time. Attached to it is a SD card reader, which is for a little SD card, just simply connected with DuPont cable. So recording on that SD card is a file, a MID file, which is a MIDI file containing this drum rhythm. And programmed onto that Arduino is some software which listens to one of its pins to see how often that gets ticked, and when it does that, it decides how fast to play the rhythm. It will loop endlessly, and it took actually quite a lot of experimentation and trying various ways in order to get that to work. So this microcontroller is dedicated only to the bike that's the drums and only to the pedaling. The other microcontroller does absolutely everything else, which is all of the buttons of all the other bikes and the pedaling of the other bikes as well. Now that has a much simpler task, and it has some things in common with the other Arduino, but basically both of them send very simple serial messages through their USB cables into a hub, and then they end up in the computer. So I thought I'd just explain about this thing called MIDI. For those who don't know what it is, it stands for Musical Instrument Digital Interface. It's been around since the 80s, and it's still pretty much the same. It's a very simple and very effective real-time protocol, and basically it means that when I press a button, I get 2 messages, one which is note on and one which is note off. I also get a channel and some data, and that data usually represents a key if it's a keyboard instrument, or if it's a percussion instrument, it's what kind of drum it is, and then also some other data like velocity, so how hard you're pressing that key. There's also numerous other messages that can be sent for all kinds of fancy things like pitch bends and other stuff. But MIDI has been around for 30 years. The thing I like about it is it's pretty much universally supported by electronic instruments, and it's very simple. So here's the console on the debugger showing the messages that the bikes are sending. I'm just pressing a button now, and you can see it says note on, note off, And there are basically two kinds of messages. There are messages which indicate a particular device, which is the bike, 0, 1 and 2, and a particular key, which is the button on that bike, and then a state, which represents what state that button is in, either pressed down or released. The other kind of message, which you just saw pop up then, is from the drum microcontroller, and that is kind of, at the moment, that message means that it's playing on its own. That's a bug in the software, which every now and then it hits a drum because it can't actually stop. It just plays very, very, very slowly. But those messages are what I call raw MIDI messages, and they are just sending MIDI data from the MIDI file in the microcontroller to say which drum to play, how hard to play, and when to play it. And this is what the app looks like. This is made in OpenFrameworks. It basically lets you choose 2 serial ports. That's all it does, and there's a little bit of diagnostic information about MIDI. And so the whole purpose of this app is that it lets you connect 2 serial ports, one for each of those microcontrollers. It reads the messages that come in over the serial ports, and then it converts them into MIDI, and it sends them to the internal software bus, MIDI bus on the Mac, which is called IAC driver bus. Once it's sent to that, it means that other bits of software are able to connect to that bus and connect and receive the MIDI messages, and in this case we're using Ableton Live. So this is the Ableton Live setup, and for each of those channels which has a yellow button active, each one of those is a bike, and they're roughly characterized as drums, lead and bass, although it's the lead and the bass are, well, it's a little bit confusing as to which is which. But when I press a button, you see the channel is active and sample gets played. Now there's something interesting about Ableton, which is that you can hit a button and then any of these things that turn purple can be attached to a MIDI button, in this case one of the buttons on the bikes. So it gives you enormous flexibility of what you can do with it. So most of the triggers that the bikes are sending are either instrument based or sample based. So they play sampled sounds or they make instruments play. Except for 2 buttons which are on the drums. The 2 buttons on the drums are effect based, and there's 2 effects. There's the flanger and the large factory, and together they sound like a pretty cacophonous mix, and they're connected using this same MIDI mapping functionality, so I can switch them on and off, and I'll just try and demonstrate that. So here you can see the 2 effects that are on the master output. These are controlled by the 2 buttons of the bike, which is the drum bike, and I'm pedaling as I do this, so I'm just trying to keep it even, but then I can hit one of the buttons and the flanger will go on, and then I can hit the other button and then the large factory effect will go on. So the rest of the setup is pretty simple, just a whole amplifier and a couple of speakers painted with yellow stripes to complete the effect.